What have you been reading this week, Brian?
Well, scarcely anything. I've been reading the first book of The Excursion over and over and over.
Because you've got a day class.
Because I've got to teach it, yes, that's right. And so I've been reading also the old Mary Moorman, The Life of Wordsworth.
That's a very boring book.
Well, it does tell you rather interesting things.
Tell me one.
She gives you the extraordinary importance of Racedown Lodge and his stay at Racedown Lodge in his development as a writer. And as a person, really. After all, he'd had his breakdown the year before. He comes to Racedown Lodge for the first time living with his sister. 1795.
Yeah.
He stays there for 2 years with his sister. And there begins, indeed completes, I suppose, both the Pedlar and the Ruined Cottage, which he thinks of as separate poems initially, and then puts them together. And I think actually it's the foundation of all his subsequent writing, and really the subsequent development of much Victorian literature.
Good God,
which stems from that moment at Racedown. Racedown really is the foundations of modern English literature.
Justify.
Because before, I think people thought of narratives as having a solution, whereas, as it were, the fact that a narrative couldn't have a solution, but that you were faced with a feeling that there should be a resolution, but you can't see what that resolution would be, and yet you fight for resolution in the face, as it were, of imponderables and great distress in the face, as it were, of your incapacity to solve the problem that the narrative sets you. That seems to me the foundation of much modern literature, and that really is Wordsworth's problem in 1795 when he begins writing The Ruined Cottage.
The Ruined Cottage, is this story of Margaret, the deserted wife, waiting for her husband to come back and he never does, is it based on somebody that he...
No! Southey, in passing, in Joan of Arc, talks about women at a time of war, I thought it was Joan of Arc that he's writing about, who wait for their husbands to return and they don't return. But that was a little thing that, unimportant to Southey really, that he mentioned in passing as one of the obvious consequences of war, but Wordsworth picks it up. And I think sees in that a situation which isn't like ordinary tragedy, which has to do with death, but with the fact, as it were, that here is a situation, a problem, as it were, that you cannot resolve. That most essential of all human motives, hope, could become a terrible responsibility to go on hoping when there is nothing actually to sustain that hope. And so you go on hoping until you die, basically, which is Margaret's terrible dilemma.
And it's almost like the hope for him coming back, the hope for story, and yet the story is just...
It's despair, in a sense, because there's nothing to redeem the hope. And yet, you see, I think the fact is that he won't despair. He can find no reason why he should not despair, except what Tennyson calls primitive feelings inside yourself, that he will not despair. Wordsworth. And that seems to me the foundation of much Victorian literature. George Eliot, for example, but also much 20th century literature, though I suppose we're closer to despair and moved closer to despair than they were in the 19th century. Our disillusion is stronger.
Sounds like it's going to be quite a good day school you've got coming up there.
So it
sounds like it's going to be quite a good day school you've got coming.
Well, I don't know about that. It's but that's what I was reading about this week, as I say, and in particular in relation to Wordsworth's biography, you see, because the year before he went to Racedown, he'd been in the throes of a massive intellectual and emotional breakdown as a result of his failure of belief in the French Revolution, as a result of the September massacres in '93 and then the terror in '94. And instead, you see, I think what he finds as the revolutionary future is literature. The revolution can't alter people, but literature can alter people. It can alter the very structure of the way in which you think. It can alter your system of feeling. And all that, though it's an enormous claim to make for literature, is in a sense more successful than anything which could be offered by Robespierre or Danton or Marat or the French Revolution. And so it's Wordsworth who believes that literature could be revolutionary in reconstructing the human mind.
Now give us one or two lines from the Ruined Cottage, book one of the...
Oh, I can't think of any.
I can.
Oh, you think of...
I can. That great line when Margaret now has died without her husband coming back, and the narrator says, because the evening is so, the day is so beautiful, and the memories are not of sadness are not just sadness. He says, why should a tear be on an old man's cheek?
But he says that halfway through the story, before he's really begun the tragedy. I think that's wonderful. He can see what's coming. Because it's midday, he can say, why should a tear be on an old man's cheek? Anticipating the tear that's going to be on the young man's cheek at the end of the story. But already he anticipates that though the young man is going to weep, he is not going to weep, even though he's the man who tells the story. He wept once, he's not going to weep again. And why? Well, we can scarcely tell. Simply because he's not going to be that figure who weeps. Because being moved by the story of Margaret, loving her though she's dead, is as it were to give her a terrible, apparently wasteful life a kind of retrospective value. It moves us, it stays in our memory.
And anyway, the old man will die soon. You better get something other than tears, because of this thing of Wordsworth, sorrow that is not sorrow to hear of.
Yes, that's right. Because there is something else that persists in us. There is the sense, as it were, that life goes on. There is the sense, as it were, that we can be moved by other people's terrible disasters. And it's not, that sounds awfully sort of heartless, as though other people's disasters might be justified by the fact, as it were, that we are moved by it. That would be terrible, as the old man says before he tells the story, if it was a purely aesthetic response. It's not. It's because it enters into the very structure of our minds and so alters us. So in some sense they're alive still, in here, in our heads. They alter the configuration of our response to life.